Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar on creating the conditions of kindness. I'm Debs Allen. I'm the Innovation and Future Thinking Manager here at SFHA, and I'm really pleased this morning to be able to welcome Ben Thurman, Policy and Development Officer with Carnegie UK Trust, to speak to us on this really important subject. So, for those of you joining us for the first time, firstly, it's great to have so many of you here. This session has been really well booked, and I can see the people that have been admitted that it's already really well attended. So just a little bit of housekeeping. So we do record these sessions so that you can come back and refresh your memory and rewatch if you want to, or share with colleagues. So the recording will be available on our website along with the slides from the session within the next few days. The format of the session will be that Ben has prepared a presentation for us for the first part of the session, and we'll speak for around 30 minutes. Now, we're trying something slightly different today to the standard webinar, which is obviously why we're in a Zoom meeting and we can see each other rather than just transmitting blindly, which is very often how these things go. So we're running this session as a camera on session, as we're keen that it's as interactive as possible. So we want to run this session as a meeting. Think of it as a roundtable that we would have if we were in the olden days and we were in an office and we were able to actually sit and have a conversation with each other, again, about this really important subject. So the way that we're going to do that is say the cameras will be on, and we encourage you to keep them on if that's something that you're comfortable with. Throughout the session, we'd encourage you to use the chat to ask questions, share comments or observations. And then once Ben's finished his presentation, we'll move on to a wider conversation around this really important subject of kindness, and would ask that you continue to use the chat function, or alternatively, if you're feeling brave, use the raise hand function, and when we come to you, unmute yourself to contribute. We can't unmute you, so we'd ask that when we come to you, do that yourself. So Ben, we're really looking forward to hear about how we can build and sustain a culture of kindness. So over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the introduction and the chance to speak to you all today. It's really lovely to see so many people here. As you can see on the slides, I'm going to talk about creating the conditions for kindness. And it's always incredibly reassuring that this feels like something that people want to talk about, because we think it's quite important at the Trust. We've been thinking about and working on kindness for about 4 or 5 years now. But it definitely feels like a word that's gained more currency over the last 12 months and become more explicit in the way that people are talking about how we're responding to coronavirus. It's something that feels like Nicola Sturgeon mentions almost every time she gets up behind a podium for a daily briefing, urging us all to be kind and to look out for one another. But it's also something that has been at the heart of the way that a lot of organisations have changed their approach to support communities and the people that they work with. And we're interested in both of these things, what we can do to build kind of communities where people feel that they belong, that they're connected to those around them, but also how we can create organizational cultures that enable staff to act in kindness. And I suppose, yeah, just thinking about this before I came to speak to you today, it feels like both of these sort of areas, angles on kindness, are quite core to what housing associations do. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspectives, particularly on the last 12 months, when we get a chance to move into the discussion a little bit later on. And I just want to sort of dwell on that title for a little moment. So we talk about creating the conditions for kindness, because we found that there are certain things that make kindness more or less possible. So it's not so much about telling people that they have to be more kind, because we know that doesn't really work and it sort of changes the very nature of it. We think it's more about looking at the way that we design our neighbourhoods and places, our services, our organisations, and whether they provide the space and the permission for people to really sort of connect with each other. So as Deb said, I'm planning to speak for about 30 minutes, and what I was thinking of doing in that time was just to give you a little bit of background on the work that we've been doing on kindness since about 2016, why we think it's more than just something that's nice to have, but actually quite at the heart of achieving better outcomes for people. and then to share a little bit about what we've been hearing from our networks about the role of kindness in the response to COVID. And I'm really grateful to Molly, who is going to manage my slides today, because unfortunately my internet connection doesn't seem to be able to cope with my voice, my face, and a PowerPoint presentation at the same time. So if you could just move on to the next slide, please, that'd be fantastic. So this is just a bit of background on the Carnegie UK Trust that I work for. We're based in Dunfermline, and we're set up just over 100 years ago with a remit to improve the lives and well-being of people in the UK and Ireland. This is obviously a very big topic, and it's taken a wide range of different forms over the last 100 years or so. Today, our work focuses on influencing policy and practice. And as I just mentioned, we've been working on kindness for the last 4 or 5 years as a value that we think can really help us to improve outcomes in public services and organisations, and by extension, improve societal well-being. And just on to the next slide, if you would. We've not been the only ones doing this, and thinking about kindness and public policy is part of a growing field. And before the pandemic started to dominate all of our thinking, there'd been a quiet revolution in thinking about how we address current social problems. So you've got on that slide there people like Hilary Cottam, who, if you haven't read, I'd really urge you all to do so, talking about radical help, and a range of other academics and networks that have been talking about the importance of relationships in society. And together, they've sort of tried to articulate and advocate for a shift away from approaches that are quite transactional and bureaucratic towards more community and human solutions. But despite this kind of growing momentum and evidence around the importance of relationships, because all the evidence shows that relationships are at the the heart of well-being, this approach still sits on the edge of our sort of existing approach to public policy, to service delivery, an approach that really sort of prioritizes quite efficient services and a one-size-fits-all model. And we were interested in why this might be the case. And just on the next slide is an image that was taken from a report that we wrote with Julia Unwin a couple of years ago now. And in this report, she argued that there's 2 languages in the way that we talk about public policy. There's the rational lexicon on the left there, which talks about efficiency and transparency, data and evidence, value for money particularly. All of these things are really important, and we're not suggesting that they're not, because we know that our organizations need to be fair and safe and transparent and also efficient as well. But there's also that other language on the right-hand side there, the language of relationships and connection, grief and loneliness, love and kindness, all of the things that really matter most to people. And as I said just earlier, all of the evidence is telling us that people do better when they experience human connection. And we know that some of the the greatest failings in our society have happened when there's been no humanity involved in sort of decision making. So it's we think it's really vital that policymakers, organizations at every level are able to speak in both of these languages, to blend the important systems and processes with their emotional intelligence and a real sort of deep understanding of people and communities and what matters to them. And the risks occur when we start to rely on one lexicon at the expense of the other. And just on the next slide, please. We began to use the word kindness to talk about the importance of this relational language, and think about how we can build it into the way that we design services and make decisions. And we did this because we found it allows us to have a slightly different type of conversation, one that's hopefully evidenced by lots of people turning up to talk about it today. kindness can easily be used in place of a lot of these words, some of which are on the screen there, a lot of the ways and sort of phrases that we use to describe social policy and what we do. But I think because we all know what it feels like to really experience kindness, and it's something that we've all, it's a word that we've all known since we were children. It allows us to have a slightly different conversation. It breaks down some of the kind of more professional barriers in the way that we talk about things. And I think the other part of it is, at its root, kindness is about treating other people like kin. And so that gives a certain simplicity to conversations about policy and practice, because we can just ask ourselves, if that was your kin, if that was your brother, sister, mother, cousin, would you want them to be treated in that way? Just on the next slide, please, when you're ready. So that's why we found that kindness is quite a powerful word, but there's also a risk that kindness can come across as quite soft and fluffy, that it's just sort of conflated with being a bit nicer to one another, and that doesn't really have a place in the sort of like important practical decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis. We don't think this is the case, and for that reason we've sort of started talking about kindness in terms of these three different levels that you see on the slide here. So the first one in the middle there is that notion of random acts of kindness, which hopefully a lot of you are aware of. It's quite popular on social media, just those quite simple things that we can do to show kindness to other people, giving money to charity, smiling at strangers, paying forward a coffee for someone in a cafe. All generally positive acts, but because they're random and quite often anonymous, often the value is more to the giver than the receiver. So our work for the last few years has been more interested in this sort of idea of relational kindness, which is that sort of next level, which we've sort of talked about as requiring us to engage with the reality of people's lives and to pick up on different cues and notice when they might need a little bit of help more than usual. And we think it's that type of kindness, that type of behavior that really helps to build connection and that improves people's well-being in communities. And, that gives people a sense that they're cared for, which is really quite critical. I think the other part of it is that it also entails risk, because we all know that when we reach out to someone, it can be difficult, it can be quite uncomfortable. We don't always know what's going to happen, and we might get in over our heads. And that sort of sets it apart from some of the types of random acts of kindness that we talk about. But I suppose what we've learned about relational kindness over the years is that we only tend to behave in this way to people who are like us, and we're less good at supporting people who are different for whether that's age or race or class or whatever. And we only tend to do it when we feel like we have the time, and when we don't feel under pressure and sort of pulled in different directions. So that final category that we talk about is radical kindness, and it's this that we're really trying to embed in different organizations we've been working with. And that, I suppose, asks us to be kind indiscriminately, even to people who are different from us, even when we're under pressure, even when it feels easier not to do so. And I think it's that concept of radical kindness that could really be quite transformational particularly in organizations. So how can we encourage this type of kindness? Well, if we could go on to the next slide, please. Some of our practice-based research with communities in Scotland has told us that the things that you would do to encourage kindness in communities are actually fairly simple. First of all, people need welcoming places to meet and gather and just bump into each other. And there's something really important about valuing and enabling the sort of informal opportunities to interact with each other. So, activities and formal activities and services are really important, but so are the things that happen in between those spaces. And we found that it's quite critical to think about how we create time and permission for people to step outside of their roles and engage with people in a slightly less transactional way and in a more human way, I suppose. And that, I think we found that to be true whether we're talking about, care workers, social workers, or even a supermarket cashier or just a neighbour chatting over a garden fence. It's about creating that sort of time and permission to connect with each other in a human way. And I think another really interesting part of this work is that we found that just the act of sort of noticing, recognizing, celebrating kindness in our everyday lives has a real impact. And I think even on a sort of personal level, but across the organizations and communities that we've been working with, we've heard that just talking about kindness and recognizing it as something that's important leads people to become more aware, more likely to notice when other people need a bit of help and support. And this can create a sort of ripple effect and build a movement. And that's been one really interesting thing that we've noticed, particularly in the way that people have talked about communities and that sort of like national narrative about kindness in communities during COVID. Obviously, on the sort of flip side of that, the pandemic has placed additional challenges on encouraging kindness and building connection, and it's really kind of like separated us from our physical spaces and thrown us into lots of less than ideal situations like this, where I'm broadcasting to you through a computer screen. But I think the sort of core principle of thinking not just about the service and the transaction, but about the relationships that happen in between that still holds true. And so we began a couple of years ago to think about applying this to organizations and really asking ourselves, how can we embed kindness into a whole organization approach? How can we create systems that give staff the permission to make meaningful connections with colleagues and service users rather than inhibiting those kind of innate motivations? And just on the next slide, when you're ready. But when we started to do that, what we noticed is that there's quite a lot of things that actually get in the way of kindness within organizations in general. And I suppose that across the board, and there are definitely exceptions, and I'm sure there are probably exceptions on this call right now, but across the board, a lot of our organizations have begun to rely increasingly on the rational lexicon at the expense of the relational one. So there's been this, what we call sort of squeeze on kindness due to a range of really sort of big external pressures on the top there, on austerity and pressures on expenditure, which make things really difficult to have the time to invest in relationships. The sort of changing nature of demand and just sort of rising demand for services, and also that kind of audit and target culture that only values what it can count. And this in turn has sort of created internal pressures. So we've got really quite high levels of scrutiny in our organizations, particularly in the public sector, which has sort of created at times risk averse culture and sometimes a blame culture as well, which all of which sort of acts as barriers to kindness. And I think this sort of slide is all sort of feels quite theoretical when you present it like this, but what these pressures do is crowd out the space for kindness in frontline services, for want of a better word, but for the people who are engaging with service users on a day-to-day basis. And we know that doctors, nurses, teachers, social workers, people working in housing, all go into these professions because they want to help people. But we seem to have inadvertently created systems that encourage and incentivize staff to prioritize targets over relationships and processes over people. And just to go to the next slide, we sort of did this research and then began to work with a number of different people over the past couple of years to see what we could do to create the conditions for kindness in our organizations and to challenge some of these things that get in the way and create enabling environments for our workforces. And we've had hundreds of people who've engaged with some of these quite exploratory projects to see what we can do to put kindness into practice. And the example that you see on the screen here is from North Ayrshire Council, who have developed a kindness promise as part of their approach to embedding kindness across the community planning partnership. And it talks about the importance of trusting staff, about creating space for kindness, critically about ensuring that performance management systems align with organizational values and allow staff to behave in a particular way. And all of this work had happened sort of pre-COVID, and it's taken us up to the beginning of last year. And I suppose we'd seen increased momentum in that time behind the idea of kindness as a way to bring out the best for both staff and those that they work with. But there are still quite a lot of barriers in terms of putting it into practice. And I think specifically found that it's really hard to shift some of those embedded approaches to risk and targets and accountability. So what I want to do just for the sort of second half of this presentation is just moving on to the next slide, is to talk about what we've noticed happening over the last 10 months. So at the end of 2019, we brought together this kindness leadership network, which was made up of leaders and organisations across health, social care, housing, local government, employability, different sectors across the UK, which you can see on the map here. All of whom had an interest in implementing kindness in different ways in their own contexts. And we, I suppose, wanted to use this network of peer support to see if we could sort of really move kindness off the page and into practice. And although we weren't able to do any of the practical activities that we had anticipated because of coronavirus, we did sort of keep these conversations going. And I suppose over the course of last year found that a lot of things that had previously got in the way of kindness, a lot of those sort of barriers had suddenly fallen away. And because of the emergency nature of the pandemic, we'd heard that our organisations had had to adapt and respond at speed, and that meant relying much less on the kind of established formal processes and ways of working, and much more on trusting staff and embracing innovation and just sort of trusting people to focus on the needs of people and communities and deliver what really matters to them. So I'm just going to talk through what this network has told us over the past few months. Before I do that, I just wanted to make two sort of quick disclaimers. First of all, that we're very clear that COVID has had quite colossal negative impacts and will continue to do so, and that these have impacted the most those who had the least to start with. So none of this is kind of dismissing that. But we do think that it's quite important that to learn about some of the positive changes that have happened over the past few months as well, to think about what we can do to hold on to these positive changes, and that these might actually help us to navigate some of the really significant challenges that lie ahead. And I suppose that the second one is that a lot of these conversations were held in the summer, autumn time of last year, when things perhaps felt a little bit more optimistic than they have done in the depths of winter. We are bringing together the network next month to revisit this and talk about whether everything in it sort of still feels relevant to the context today. And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on whether these kind of changes resonate with you and your experience as well. So on the next slide is what we have heard about kindness during COVID. So we we began by asking people, what has COVID taught us about kindness in organisations, and what they fed back sort of and discussed fell under these sort of 7 themes that you see on the slide there. I'm just going to get a glass of water because I don't normally talk for quite this long. So first of all, people reflected on how the crisis had sort of allowed or given people a bit more flexibility and permission to really focus on the needs of individual people. We'd heard a lot of organisations doing sort of welfare calls just to check in on how people are, which were far beyond the kind of remit of people's and organisations' roles, but we heard that they actually kind of allowed people to kind of build more trusting relationships, and that had kind of gone on to unlock more positive interactions in the future, and allowing a more personalised approach, and also being more fulfilling for staff involved. There was quite a lot of energy around this type of activity. And this approach to well-being also extended to caring about staff in a much more explicit way than before. I think there's something about that sort of universal disruption to work and family life that meant organisations had really sort of sharpened their focus on staff well-being. People talked about feeling quite empowered in being trusted to manage their own workloads alongside caring responsibilities, of that kind of transparency and communication, and a real desire to listen to what staff were experiencing, and to hear some of the challenges that they were facing as well. I think in many places, moving on to that sort of third bullet point, one of the things that had allowed organisations to change their approach towards well-being of both staff and service users was the things that they stopped doing. So people told us quite a lot about the sort of relaxation or suspension of the targets that they're normally held accountable to, whether that's at a sort of senior leadership level or just sort of manager or even a kind of practitioner. That not having to think about delivering certain numbers and figures had given them the freedom to sort of act in kindness with whoever that was with. And I think another really quite striking comment was that people were able to help everybody. So a lot of the kind of eligibility criteria had been taken away that had just allowed people to work with those who might not have fit the remit of their service in the past. And there was something about that sort of sudden realization that you, as a person working for an organization, have the power to actually help people in the way that you would want to, that was quite empowering and fulfilling for the people that we spoke to. We also heard quite a lot about partnership working, and I think in a lot of cases this was necessitated by just the scale of the challenge, but people also noticed how a lot of the hierarchies, the sort of narrow organizational silos that had prevented sort of true partnership and collaboration in the past had sort of been replaced by a sense of common purpose that allowed organizations to work together much more proactively. I think this was particularly pronounced with colleagues in health and social care who have been, talking about integration and cohesion for years and years and years, and suddenly it became possible in a matter of weeks. So that, I guess that was sort of partnership between organisations. I think possibly even more powerful was what we heard about organisations working with communities, increasingly spoken of as equal partners in sort of delivering a vision and sort of supporting people, particularly in local government and housing. People had recognised that it wasn't really the organisations and services that led the way. It was communities and community organisations that were able to respond at speed in the initial phase, and in certain places, this has seeded a much more enabling approach towards working with communities. Organisations had sort of spoken about taking away some of the the bureaucracy and the governance that sometimes prevents that kind of organic community activity, and really developing an approach based around asking, what can we do to help in order to allow communities to thrive. And I think a big thing that had sort of made this possible was that sort of idea about recalculating risk. People had talked about the sort of relaxation of not necessarily relaxation of rules, but attitudes towards the rules around GDPR, data sharing, budget restrictions, and staff really were sort of given the backing and trust from senior management to do the right thing for people, and to navigate some of these complexities in a way that sort of delivered the best for the communities that we were working with. And this sort of environment and this permission really allowed some of the organisations that we were working with, and probably important to recognise that these were all organisations who had a sort of pre-existing sort of motivation around kindness, but it had allowed them to give staff the autonomy to support communities in a way that brought out the best for everybody involved. And finally, I think no conversation about what's happened over the last 10 months is complete without touching on technology a little bit. There's obviously a lot of challenges involved, but kind of lockdown has made human relationships a lot harder in certain situations. We did also hear alongside this that it can have quite a enabling and empowering impact in certain situations, and particularly with organisations that covered quite large geographies, removing the need for like face-to-face meetings, whether that was with kind of outpatient appointments or kind of check-ins for people on employability programs. Actually suddenly embracing technology and saying, we can focus on what's best for that particular person, and if we're able to do something on Zoom or telephone rather than forcing them to travel an hour each way, that is that can have a much more sort of like person-centered focus on our service delivery. So that's what we sort of heard over the last 10 months. And if you could just go to the next slide, which I think is the last one. I think, kind of picking out these kind of 7 quite potentially positive changes does present quite a rosy picture in some ways. And we know that this hasn't happened everywhere. And we know that even where it has happened, there's still been huge challenges and huge negative impacts on certain groups of people, regardless. But we do think it's important to try and understand some of what we've learned from last year, and how we can hold on to some of the positive changes sort of underpinned by kindness. And I suppose one of the main reasons for this, in a sort of closing thought, I suppose, before the pandemic, when we were talking about this, probably the most consistent refrain from organizations was that we just don't have the time to do this. We don't have the time to invest in resources and people's time to actually allow them to bring kindness to their work in a sort of truly sort of embedded way. And then during COVID, we've seen a situation where people have been more stretched than ever before, with more workload intensity, with balancing that with a wholly different sort of domestic life as well. And we've still seen this sort of sudden resurgence of kindness. So if it wasn't the time, we need to think about what are the things that have suddenly changed to actually allow this to happen. And at the end of our work with North Ayrshire Council, which sort of finished around the summer, autumn, we sort of like reviewed what had happened and sort of suggested these 5 priorities to sustain the approach that had allowed them to respond so effectively during the pandemic, which you can see on the slide here. I think all of these kind of priorities relate to some of the stuff that we talked about on the previous slide. Critical within this, we think, is thinking about what we can take away from existing pressures within our organisations, to the pressure to deliver transactions as efficiently as possible. What we can take away from that to give people the time and space to focus on kindness, to work in partnership, to share power with communities. But perhaps the most important is thinking about how we can shift power within our organizations so that people engaging with service users, tenants, patients, whatever we're calling them in our organizations, they're the ones that have the autonomy to behave in the way that feels right, to use their skill to understand that relationship and deliver the best for everybody involved. So that's what we've been, I suppose, hearing and learning and thinking over the past 10 months. And at this point, I'd be just really keen to open up to discussion, to hear from you if or where you've noticed kindness in your work, what changes COVID has brought about that you'd like to keep, and what you think the priorities should be for your organisations as we look to emerge from the pandemic. Some links on, I think these will be sent around to you after the webinar, but there's some links on that final slide to some of the stuff that I've mentioned just now.